I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. One thing I love about historical fiction, and especially historical fiction that covers relatively recent events, is that it gives me a way to learn about political events, about conflict, in a more personal and nuanced way. And that's what I loved about Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshananthan. Brotherless Night is a novel set in the first decade of Sri Lanka's civil war. It's about a Tamil girl named Sashi. Sashi wants to become a doctor, but those dreams get upended as her family is torn apart by the conflict. Now, if you're anything like me before I read Brotherless Night, you might not be super familiar with the history of Sri Lanka's civil war. So here's what you need to know. Sri Lanka is a country of many diverse ethnic communities. The conflict during the Civil War was between the majority Sinhalese state security forces and minority Tamil separatist groups, such as the Tamil Tigers. The Civil War officially began in 1983 and lasted for 26 years. V.V. Ganeshananthan is an American born to Sri Lankan Tamil immigrants. She spent around 20 years researching and writing Brotherless Night, using all of her experience and training as a journalist to dive deep into the experiences of people who lived through the Sri Lankan Civil War. This year, Brotherless Night won two of the biggest fiction prizes in the world, the UK Women's Prize and the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction. Vivi joined me from her home in Minneapolis. She commonly goes by the name Sugi, so that's how I'll be referring to her during our conversation. So, Sugi, welcome to Bookends. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be in conversation with you.
So I want to start by talking about the narrator of your novel, this character Sashi, who's 16 years old at the start of the book. And she's a bright girl. She's studious. She was really trying to achieve great things, studying for a place in medical school. Can you tell me a little bit more about her and situate what her hopes and dreams are for the future at the start of this novel?
Sure. So when the novel begins, it's 1981, and she is studying for university entrance exams, which she anticipates taking relatively soon. She is trying to follow in the footsteps of her grandfather, who's someone who provided reproductive health care to women in the capital city of Colombo. And she also comes from a society and a community where that particular profession of physician is really mythologized, valorized, idealized. Doctors are heroes and also understood to have comparatively comfortable lives. So she thinks that this is both a moral profession and also one that could help her and her family. So she's interested in pursuing that. And her oldest brother, who is also probably her favorite brother, is already a doctor and is trying to help her by doing things like passing along his textbooks. So there are a lot of students in Sri Lanka kind of during this time period who are perhaps studying to become doctors because that's what they think they should do. And she does think she should do it, but she's also actually interested in the science of it, which is something that the book is attempting to convey, her kind of genuine interest in this kind of caregiving and medicine.
I'm from a family of many siblings myself. I'm one of four, and seeing this sort of special connection between an older sibling and someone who was a lot younger, I loved reading about. Can you tell me a little bit more about Sashi's relationship with Niranjan specifically? Because, yeah, you kind of mentioned he's like the favorite brother, the one that she maybe has the strongest connection with, particularly in this shared passion for medicine that they have.
So her brother Niranjan, he is someone who, she idealizes the profession generally. She idealizes him specifically. He's her hero. All of the siblings get along with him. He's sort of a leader and a peacemaker. And he's someone who's generally very calm, very steady. But he's also, in his own way, a little bit of a quiet rebel. He's involved in student groups that are doing progressive reading. There's a little bit of an implication that he might be involved in some kinds of activism. So he's also someone who tells Sashi that she should see things for herself and not just listen to what other people say. He encourages in her a kind of independence, including an independence from him. And when she finds herself in a particularly difficult moment struggling with her studies, he comes up with a way for her to go on an adventure and to accompany him to a new place. And all of this means a huge amount to her. And she also just thinks he's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really got that. They seem to enjoy spending time together. So Sashi and her family are from the ethnic Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. And I know that this is obviously the history of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, and what the experience of the Civil War was like for them is complex and would be an entire other conversation, just completely outside the scope of how you talk about it in your book. But for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the history of the Tamil community, can you tell me a little bit about their background in Sri Lanka and how some of the historical context of their experiences under colonialism, for instance, set the stage for this conflict that we saw play out from the 80s into the 2000s?
I appreciated the precision with which in your introduction you mentioned that the war was fought primarily between Sri Lankan government security forces and Tamil separatists, perhaps the best known of those being the Tigers. I find that when I read about the war, it's often described in binary terms. So it is perhaps described as Tamil versus Sinhalese. And in fact, Sri Lanka has a number of communities and multiple Tamil communities. So the Tamil community in Jaffna, which is the one that Sashi comes from, is quite particular. And a lot of the Tamil community was educated in English or was fluent in English. And during the British colonial period, Tamil representation in civil service was very common. And post-independence in 1948, there were some measures taken to address what was seen as an inequality in how these communities had been treated. So, for example, there was a Sinhala-only act talking about what would be used as the official government language. So early in the book, you see Sashi's father remembering, and he's a civil servant, that, you know, there was a moment when people were sort of told, you have to learn Sinhalese or you're going to lose your jobs. And so British colonialism, in a very classic for British colonialism fashion, pitted communities against each other. And then after the empire left-ish, those communities, in attempting to address those historical injustices, sometimes created new problems or entrenched older ones rather than working in a more pluralistic way to address them.
For folks who maybe, again, are not as familiar with Tamil separatism, I guess like separatism kind of implies they're fighting for a distinct state. What exactly were the Tamil Tigers fighting for? Like, what was their political aim during this time?
Well, the Tigers, which were one of several Tamil militant groups in the 1980s in Sri Lanka, claimed to be the sole representatives of the Tamil people. And they said they were fighting for a separate state in the north and east of the country. And those different groups had political nuance among them. They had different personalities and strategies and political thoughts, or lack thereof, as well. So you can see the fabric of those different groups still, I think, woven through our community. And you could sometimes find people who were affiliated with multiple groups in one family, possibly even siblings. And the conversation between the groups was often contentious and sometimes violent. In the end, the Tigers emerged as dominant, partly through the violent tactics that they used against other groups, and other groups did that as well. So Tamil nationalism and Tamil separatism, there are so many strands of it and so many different versions of it. But I think the best known at this point is probably still the version that the Tigers put forward. And I think it's worth noting that the Tigers claimed sole representation of the Tamil people, and they were not elected, and they were known particularly for clamping down on forms of dissent. Mm-hmm. And that's also something you see in the book.
Yeah, that's a huge feature of what you see in the book. And I absolutely want to dive more into this sort of like unique position that Sashi finds herself in. But before we get into that, I want to talk a bit more. You mentioned the city of Jaffna playing a pivotal role in this book, and it is central in your story, and it's a very particular community. And it's been a big focus of your imagination over the years. Your previous novel, Love Marriage, was also centered on a family from Jaffna, even as it largely unfolds in the U.S. What is so particular about Jaffna? Like, can you talk perhaps a bit about its cultural and political significance? Why does it hold such a big role in your imagination particularly?
Simply because a good chunk of my family comes from there, grew up there, and I grew up hearing stories about Jaffna and its particular cultures. And then I also developed an interest in my travels in seeing ways that that culture transformed in diaspora communities around the world, including in Toronto, for example, but also in places like Paris. All over the world, you can see traces of the stories that I heard that were set there, that are present in these communities of people who have migrated and their children. And Jaffna has an almost, again, a kind of mythical place, at least in my imagination, probably in a lot of the imaginations of many other Sri Lankan Tamil people. It's sometimes referred to as a Tamil capital city. It was sort of the site of a lot of culture making, a lot of iconic places, certain kinds of art. And it's also a place that is can be extraordinarily rigid. And it's a place where, for example, for many, many generations, like caste is observed and practiced. Those were some of the stories that I would hear growing up about caste stratification. And it also was a place where Tamil nationalism was really strong. And all of these things were of interest to me. Like also the Tamil pursuit of education, the single-minded pursuit of education, is something that I associate with Jaffna, with a kind of intense work ethic.
I know you've talked before in some of your other interviews and in some of your writings about a kind of like almost propaganda narrative that I think, you perhaps learned, I guess, growing up in diaspora, hearing some of these stories, hearing about these, politically progressive movements and sort of happenings in Sri Lanka. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because propaganda was an interesting word to me when I saw it crop up.
I think that living in a society where propaganda is everywhere now, it's very interesting to look back at my childhood and see the places that I was also exposed to it. I mean, from a very young age, I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and I think was very influenced by being in proximity to the American federal government, and also the site of a lot of international policymaking and organizations like the World Bank or embassies, what have you. All of that was kind of part of the social fabric of the place where I grew up. So propaganda was anything from being a little kid in school who learned the Pledge of Allegiance and thought that I don't know, should be loyal to Reagan because he was the American president, a position I now find really preposterous.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a very little kid in my defense, but
no, yeah, but, we can't always expect little kids to have like a good developed hot take on the Pledge of Allegiance and whether or not it should happen in schools.
But I was the sort of kid who was like, but you told me there was separation of church and state. So when I got to one nation under God, I would never say it.
I love that. That's the sort of thing that I'm sure I would have done if I lived in the U.S. and had to say that growing up too.
Just kind of like, but this is inconsistent. It's logically inconsistent, my parents would say. If this is the only logically inconsistent thing you encounter in your life, well done.
Yeah.
So I think that propaganda, was sort of everywhere. It was in the fabric of American life. And of course, in the fabric of diaspora, in the things that the Sri Lankan state said. Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story. And I think, of course, in a war, what do people do? What do stakeholders do except for, by and large, advance single stories? The story of the state's, protection of civilians, humanitarian operations, the evil terrorists, right? If you paint with a very broad brush, it is easy to do and politically convenient. And of course, also Tamil nationalism was sometimes putting forward a narrative that would omit, say, atrocities committed by Tamil militants. And to be fair, also as a kid, I did hear stories that disrupted this kind of propaganda. One of the historical figures who appears in both Love Marriage and in Brotherless Night, there are teachers in both books who bear a strong resemblance to C.E. Anandaraja, who was the principal of St. John's College, who was assassinated by the Tigers for arranging a cricket match between his students in the Sri Lankan army cricket team. So that was a story that I heard when I was little from someone who had strong sympathies for people who were critical of the state and was also completely heartbroken by what had happened to this teacher, this educator.
Mm-hmm. Part of Jaffna's history is this intentional burning of its public library in the spring of 1981. Nearly 100,000 books and manuscripts were destroyed in this attack that really is an attack, I think, on Tamil culture. Why was this an important event to include in the novel? Obviously, it sounds like it was of great historical importance, but it's an event that seems to have a massive, massive impact on the characters.
Yeah, I think that was a story that I heard growing up, and the library does burn in my first novel too. And yeah, I think as you describe, it's biblioclasm. It is an attack on Tamil culture, right? There were single copy Ola leaf manuscripts, irreplaceable documents that were torched by people who were aligned with the state, and the state, right, also not taking action really to stop that. And people commonly date the beginning of the war to the 1983 anti-Tamil pogroms that took place in Colombo. But I think that one of the events that precedes that's most commonly referred to is the library. And I was interested in it as a repository of culture and as a place where the past was enshrined. And also, as a little kid, I went to my library and hung out there. And for me, it was not just a site of the past, but also very much a site of the present and the future. So it was really also a place that was a gathering place. It was a place where I could think about what I was going to do with my life in a kind of bigger way than I might somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in representing that through the family, that they know the rare books are there. They care about that. That means something to them. And also it's just a space where they've been together with their friends that isn't their house, and a place where they think, and then it's gone. Mm-hmm.
So, Sugi, the moment that people generally see as the kicking off point of the Sri Lankan Civil War was this series of anti-Tamil pogroms that began in Colombo in 1983, commonly known as Black July. For listeners who haven't heard about Black July, aren't familiar, the violence was triggered when 13 state soldiers were ambushed by Tamil militants. And Sinhalese mobs who would have been in support of the state attacked, burned, looted, and killed Tamil civilians in their homes and businesses. Now, these riots are a major fracturing point for the characters in Brotherless Night, and they're especially tragic for Niranjan, who's Sashi's beloved and favorite oldest brother, who we were talking about a bit earlier. Can you talk a bit about what happens in the novel and the impact on Sashi's family?
Yeah, I think that, so Niranjan is killed in the riots, and in the wake of Niranjan's death, the family kind of doesn't have its rudder. Sashi, I think, feels some level of guilt about being someone who has survived this. She and Niranjan have gone to Colombo together. And then when the riots begin, Niranjan says he and his friend leave the house. And they have sort of said, we're going out to see what the situation is, and then we'll come back and get you. They never come back. And Sashi has 3 other brothers. The oldest of them is Dialan, who had been working at the public library, whose heart was already kind of broken by that. And he is quiet and is supposed to go and study to become an engineer. And then the next brother, Seelan, who has kind of a hot temper and is also interested in becoming an engineer. And the 2 of them, they're really unmoored. They're supposed to go to university, and now Sashi has a conversation with Seelan where Seelan sort of thinks, do you actually think that's going to happen? I have no intention now of doing that. And he and Dylan go off and join the Tigers. So they go to India, where they train with the movement. Seelan is someone who is very angry in the wake of his brother's murder. And to me, his anger was very intelligible. I find that the language of the War on Terror is kind of used to render people unreadable, as though they are impermeable, mysterious. It's almost another form of Orientalism. And I don't love Seelan as a character necessarily. Like, he's not someone I would, I mean, I guess I love him, but I'm not sure I like him all the time. And also, he's very intelligible to me. That anger is very readable. So I was interested in making that legible, and also in showing the ways that people who might be understood to be kind or even gentle, like Dylan, might end up in a movement that people would characterize broadly as brutal.
I'm wondering then, we see this kind of disappearance of young men from the fabric of civil society, where they're joining militant groups, they're dying in conflict. Like, what does that do to a society? It's like so drastic seeming to me.
That's a great question. I think, what does it do to a society to have its young people targeted in this way, and specifically its young men? I mean, I think you can see it in other places, right? Like in Ukraine, where men of a certain age were required to stay, and then there's a mass displacement of women and children. So here you see like the division and militarization of society as people who had been Tamil civilians take up arms and become Tamil militants, as the Sri Lankan military and Indian peacekeepers move into this space and everyone's carrying arms. Like, what does that mean for the people who aren't carrying arms, who, by the way, are primarily women and children, right? There is a way that surveillance crept into like every aspect of society, including spaces that were only Tamil people, where Tamil people might be surveilling each other to see what their allegiances were. Do we believe that you're behaving appropriately in this situation? So it becomes a pretext for intense distrust. And there is a part in the book where Sashi sort of talks about the language for death. And the language for death has been, to that point, primarily language for the old. And they don't really have language for the death of young people, which was a point that one of my friends made to me. She was reading the book and she sort of said, that like we didn't know how to talk about this, because like the actual death rituals are the children mourning the parents, not the parents mourning the children. So everything, you're in the upside down.
I want to talk a little bit more then about sort of Sashi's journey in the wake of Niranjan's death, and as she's grappling with, as you say, this like very complex environment of surveillance, of fear from all sides. Sashi faces this conflict where, she's in medical school, she's doing this training, and she finds herself working for the Tamil Tigers in a field hospital during her first year in medical school. How does she end up in this position? Like, what's her decision-making architecture like?
I wish for Sashi that she had a decision-making architecture. I think it would help her. I'm not sure she has one. I think that, like a lot of people, Sashi does things first and foremost for the people she loves and trusts, who sometimes are asking her now to do things she's a little bit unsure of. She does feel very strongly about medicine and equitable treatment, that people who are sick or injured should be able to get treatment. And so she sees her participation in this field hospital at the invitation of a childhood friend who she wants to help. But she sees that also as a kind of moral mission, although she's aware that the setting is a contested one. So I think that she's frequently unsure. And so she's just often doing the best she can. And I think a person could reasonably argue she's making understandable choices that are also probably not always clearly the best choices. But maybe she doesn't have that many good choices.
There's like also a very gendered dynamic, I think, in the sort of different choices that Sashi is able to make and the choices that her brothers are making, where it's like she's almost a little bit envious, I think, of the way that her brothers are able to participate in a more militant form of fighting. There's this whole dynamic where there's this like Gandhi quote about women's place being in sort of the non-violent aspects of movement, and women really excel at non-violence. You're saying Sashi maybe doesn't necessarily have a decision-making architecture, but she's certainly like making choices.
Definitely.
I guess, like, how do you think, gender factors into all of this? Because again, like we're following like a woman's story, but the book is also called Brotherless Night, and the brothers are such a big feature.
Yeah. Sashi doesn't want her life determined by the men around her And also the men around her are quite interested in determining what her life should be and think they're doing it from like a place of best intentions, et cetera. But there's often still a kind of like benevolent paternalism to the way that she's regarded. She definitely is making choices. Her choices are sometimes circumscribed by gender. And the quote that you refer to, it's actually right late in the book, there's a feminist book club. And one of the quotes that comes up is about Gandhi talking about women being good at suffering. And Sashi says, right, she says very plainly, like, I don't want to suffer. I am not like signing up for that kind of martyrdom. Like, I'm not good at it. I don't want to be good at it. And I don't apologize. Mm-hmm. And also she suffers a lot. So I think she's trying to resist the notion that that is a woman's place, right? To sit by and bear it. She's not interested in that particularly. So she is looking for a place where she can do things, which is one of the reasons that field hospital is very appealing to her, because it's a place where she can act. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of circumscribed choice, but it's a choice that's being offered to her. And she appreciates that, actually. Mm-hmm. And it's also true that partway through this era, like the Tigers had a women's wing. Mm-hmm. And there's some complexity to the way that people talk about that too. One of the reasons that I wrote a book that is depicting primarily civilians and primarily women is that I felt that a lot of the narrative about the war and about women focuses on those women who were Cotters and the Tigers. I think those stories should absolutely be told. It is also not the predominant experience of Tamil women in the war that they were in the Tigers. That's not what happened to most women. So for Sashi to represent something else, like a woman who is affected by a militarized society, but is also not, right, her choice is not to take up arms. Mm-hmm. I wanted to make space for that in addition to that other story, which I think has had a lot of room, actually.
I want to talk more about this feminist book club, because that was like such a fascinating and interesting thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, the reading group and all of this stuff. So Sashi has a lot on the go. She's doing regular medical school. She's doing this field hospital work. And then she also meets this professor named Anjali, who's encouraging Sashi to write and to read books and to get engaged in this other kind of like more journalistic work, a different kind of intellectual work than what she's been doing. There's Nina Simone and Aretha Franklin that's being played in Anjali's office. What's the significance of this reading group and these other acts of resistance? Because I loved reading about this part of Sashi's journey and like just this cool professor that she was hanging out with.
All of that was really fun to write and is also representative of what people who attended university during that time period would talk to me about when they remembered that time in their lives, that they were putting on plays and reading things together and making art and protesting together and worrying about protesting. All of these tiny transgressions that are really ways of maintaining civil society and ordinary life. And that, I think, is the mode of resistance, right? That, like, well, there's a war on, and my mind is important, and my mind needs a place to go. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to make one. And they do. I mean, they run this feminist reading group, and definitely, like, Sashi's Google Calendar must look like hell.
Yeah.
She is so busy. I don't know when she sleeps, but she, with great determination and a kind of terrifying adrenaline, is trying also to be in conversation with people and slow her mind down in certain ways so she can think about what's happening to her. And her teacher is one of the people who encourages her in doing that. And the figure you refer to, Anjali, is based on Rajani Thiranagama, who was one of the members of University Teachers for Human Rights Jaffna, who was on the medical faculty at the University of Jaffna, and who was involved in documenting human rights violations by multiple actors during this time period. So was some of my source material. I'm really lucky that I was able to read her words. I mean, her voice is findable, which was a huge privilege.
So you actually started working on Brotherless Night about 20 years ago, from what I understand, while the Civil War was actually still unfolding. And, you know, over the years, you spoke with civilians, former militants, journalists, activists, scholars. You also read such this like rich body of material about the conflict. What were some of the challenges and joys of that process for you? And how did you also kind of separate out that journalistic training that you have with like wanting to make this beautiful work of craft? Because I was so astonished when I was reading this book. I was like, I'm learning so much detail, but it doesn't feel like I'm reading an academic work of history. It feels like I'm reading a novel and, I'm also kind of learning by accident as I go through it.
Oh, good. I do think working as a journalist was hugely helpful in that, I think that there are writers who turn a beautiful, ornate sentence. I'm probably not that person. I think I'm trying to write sentences that are intensely clear. That was my style when the material was really dense and complex. The research, we were talking earlier a little bit about skepticism and critical thinking and reading and, how do you learn to identify propaganda. And I do think trying to study Sri Lankan history as objectively as possible is an extremely good and kind of rough education. It's anything that could be weird or hard or strange or a lie or astonishingly truthful. It has all happened. Everything has happened, and someone has told the story that way. So it's all in there, but you have to be willing to be both intensely skeptical and willing to listen, to consider the idea that someone who doesn't appear to be good might have a streak of goodness in them. I would read a book and then I would go talk to someone who had lived through that time period, and I would tell them maybe what I had read in the book, and they would say, well, that's interesting. It's funny you should say that, because around that time, what I remember is this and this and this. And I would sort of in my head, have two sets of Legos and be like, I don't know what I can build out of that. Or maybe they fit together perfectly and something suddenly was explained. So it was really interesting. And yeah, really good education for reading the news now.
Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of I think baggage that comes with the idea of who has the right to authentically tell a story. And you wrote this essay for LitHub that was published the day after your novel came out, where you were grappling with the idea of authenticity and some aspects of what it means to be a writer living in diaspora who's writing about the country of your origin for your family, but not having perhaps lived through these events yourself. You weren't physically there. What made you want to write this essay? What was kind of going through your mind, I guess, that made you grapple with this question of authenticity as you were writing?
Well, I think that in the course of doing the research and also in the course of publicizing my first book, I often encountered people, generally non-Sri Lankans, who, because I was of Sri Lankan descent, would assign me a lot of authority as a spokesperson for that history and those communities. And I often felt that that was an authority I hadn't earned. And then on the other way around, if I was in conversations with Sri Lankans, often I would be assumed to know much less than I did, to have no genuine interest or credibility. So it was interesting to travel the line between those two things, to sort of think that research would be a way to actually have the authority that people were sometimes assigning me, and also a little bit to prove, it's true, I didn't live through this time period. And also, the majority of historical fiction that's published is written by people who didn't live through the time periods that they're writing about. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what historical fiction is. And so to sort of say, I think that my community deserves to have historical fiction written about it just as much as anyone else's. And I think that it's approachable. I don't think it's strange or mysterious or so complicated people can't understand it, because I'm surrounded by people who do understand it. Mm-hmm. And I'm really lucky that a lot of those people are willing to explain to me how these things worked. And having sort of been occasionally told, or having people hint that they sort of thought this was an impossible or foolish project, or just that I wasn't the person to do it, I guess I'm a little bit stubborn. And so having been told somewhere, someone is laughing at the massive understatement of that. But I don't know. I kind of like it as a dare. Can a person from the diaspora understand this time period and render it correctly? And I hope that the answer is yes. I'm sure that there are people whose experiences are not represented by this book. And I did also write it in the first person. There are things built into the craft and structure that are designed to resist the notion of a single story. And that's also very intentional. So that is a way of accommodating the research and also like very intentionally saying like this book is in community with other books. This voice is in community with other voices.
Yeah, I think that answers the question beautifully. And it's like, you obviously put in the legwork, and I'm glad that this is out in the world and you didn't listen to the stubborn people who said don't do it. We've talked a bit about just how long the process of bringing this book into the world was. And it's hard for me to imagine, like, you started writing this book when you were 24, I'm 25, and you finished it at 42. I literally can't conceive of what it means to work on one project for so long. Maybe someday I'll know. You've said a bit that you've grown up alongside your narrator, Sashi, who's also coming of age in this book. How did going on this journey with her maybe mirror or shape your own journey?
Well, I've spoken about the people who hinted that I shouldn't do this, but I think like Sashi, I actually also had along that very long trip a lot of people who thought that I could and that I should and that they were willing to help me. So I'm lucky to have been supported by a large community of people. It's a long time. It's pretty wild to me. Sometimes I'm like, I wrote that book for like almost half my life. What if it, and this is the gamble of anything like that, right? Because you have to be willing to do it, even if it doesn't find the right audience, or like the moment is not the right moment for its publication, or if it doesn't strike people the right way, you have to still be okay with having done it. That's like a pretty large risk. And I think I, like Sashi, managed to not think about that too much by just staying extremely busy. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, that would have been terrifying.
Well, I thank you for being generous yourself with sharing this conversation with me, Sugi. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
That was my conversation with Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi. She's the author of Brotherless Night. Sugi spoke to me from her home in Minneapolis. Brotherless Night was the winner of this year's UK Women's Prize and the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction. That's it for the show this week. This episode was produced by Katie Swales. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Special shout out also to everyone on the team for putting the show together this week and every week, including our amazing radio techs and the wider CBC Books team. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.